The knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain is a Middle Scots Arthurian romance written in alliterative verse of 1362 lines, known solely from a printed edition of 1508 in the possession of the National Library of Scotland. No manuscript copy of this lively and exciting tale has survived, though the story is set during Arthur and his band's journey of pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Most of the action takes place in France, with Sir Gawain, King Arthur's nephew, as its main hero. The tale actually contains two episodes borrowed from the first continuation to Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval, the story of the Grail. In the first episode, which ostensibly occurs in France somewhere west of the Rhone River, Sir Gawain succeeds in obtaining provisions merely by graciously asking, rather than by confiscating the supplies by brute force as Kay tries to do. In the second, far longer episode, Arthur and his men come to a castle on the Rhone and learn that its lord pledges allegiance to no higher sovereign. Aghast at the thought, Arthur returns to the castle after completing his pilgrimage and besieges it. The bitter conflict is decided by single combat between Sir Gawain and Gologras. The tale upholds the long-standing Arthurian tradition that Sir Gawain represents the paragon of chivalry, and his characteristic fairness makes him gain more for King Arthur than will violence alone. In the Gologras episode, Gawain's soft-spoken words alone fail to achieve results, but Gawain prevails in combat where the others have failed, and even there, it is the combination of both knightly honor and prowess that stamps the hallmark of Gawain's chivalry. For Gawain, ever the gracious victor, agrees to participate in a charade pretending to be the vanquished loser, in order to save face for his adversary Gologras. Striking friendship with such dreaded foe is reminiscent of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Texts, dating and authorship. No manuscript copy of survives, and the work is known solely through the knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain, a black-letter printed book issued in Edinburgh by the Chapman and Maillard Press. This year was the advent of the very first books being printed in Scotland by the aforementioned press. Modern commentators do not identify an author and date the composition to not long before this printing, i.e. the late 15th century. However, Madden in his edition ascribed the work to the poet of the Aunters of Arthur. Madden also gave credence to the notion that the Winters were the work of one Clerk of Tranent, acting on the hint in a line of Dunbar's poetry. Accordingly, Madden dated the composition to the first half of the 15th century, coincident with the activity of the Clerk. Another name also crops up as a speculated author of the two metrical romances, namely Chrétien, mentioned in passing in Wintoun's poem. Printed editions of the 1508 printed book, only one copy is known, preserved at the National Library of Scotland. It is bound together with other tracts of the period, 11 in all, comprising a single volume referred to as the Chapman and Maillard prints. The present work is the second tract, occupying pages 7 to 48. The volume was once owned by the Advocates' Library, with shelf mark H30A. The text resurfaced in J. Pinkerton, Scottish Poems, Volume 3, but negligently reprinted, according to Madden. A facsimile edition was published by David Lame, though this was not a literal replica but a proofed and corrected version. This 1827 facsimile was the base text later employed by Madden in his edition of the work, included in the anthology Sir Gawain. Gologras and Gawain is the spelling employed by many past commentators, but Hahn's edition substituted Gologras in the title, because that was the most frequently occurring in the text. Plot. Geographical identifications. Arthur and his band are on a pilgrimaging voyage back and forth from the Holy Land. Neither Holy Land nor Jerusalem is mentioned explicitly, and the line, seeking him over the sea who was sackless but sold, implies going to Jerusalem, the site of the Holy Sepulchre, tomb of Christ. The opening lines mention they're heading towards Tuscany, but the two major episodes take place somewhere in France. The city where Arthur replenishes provisions is of uncertain location, but presumably somewhere still to the west of the Rhone River. Gologras's castle is in the Rhone Valley. The original print reads Rome, but this is to be amended as Rhone, as occurs elsewhere. Note that Arthur vows to subjugate Gologras's castle on his way to the Holy Land, but only puts this into action after reaching Jerusalem. Retracing his route back to the Rhone, the city of provisions approaching a certain city, Arthur's large band starts running out of victuals, and Sir Kay is sent inside to buy food and provisions. The hall is deserted, but in an adjoining kitchen is a dwarf roasting a fowl, and Kay is so hungry he grabs the meat. The lord of the castle appears and rebukes him, but Kay answers defiantly, earning a thrashing. King Arthur now sends Sir Gawain to bargain with its lord. Sir Gawain courteously entreats the lord of the castle to furnish supplies at whatever price he asks. The lord says he cannot comply, but all he meant was he cannot possibly accept payment, because that would bring him insufferable shame, deserving of being drawn. The city's lord promises to furnish Arthur with an army of 30,000 whenever in need. Arthur's band is given a feast that lasts for 4 days, and is supplied with wine and wastel bread aplenty. Castle of Gologras. After many more weary days of travel, King Arthur reaches a magnificent castle on the river Rhone, in southern France. The castle boasted 33 towers in its edifice, moored alongside 40 seagoing vessels bound for distant corners of the world, and King Arthur asks who is the overlord of this wonderful place. On being told by the knowledgeable Sir Spinagros that its lord owes allegiance to nobody, Arthur is horrified and vows to make the lord submit to him upon his return. King Arthur reaches the Holy Land, and returns to Gologras's castle on the Rhone. Arthur and his retinue camp before the castle, pitching pavilion-type tents, planning the strategy, with the possibility of laying a siege in case negotiations break down. Arthur sends out 3 knights as emissaries, Gawain, Lancelot, and Gawain, but Gologras refuses to pay homage to Arthur as liege lord. The emissaries return to Arthur, and they begin preparations for a siege. Cannonballs were loaded into gaping brass cannons, and there were sharpened darts, making huge noise. Trees were felled, and hurdles put up. Inside the castle, Gologras's army too were preparing, wearing the greaves on the shins and garretories on the knees. At a glance there were 140 shields in row, with a sturdy helmet and lance upon each shield. Each knight's heraldic device was on display, with the inscribed name clearly visible. Then a great sound of the trumpet was heard from the castle, and the man who blew it strutted towards a tower, fully armed, flashing sunlight in his direction from his shield and brandishing his spear. King Arthur asked the meaning of this, and Sir Spinagros explained it was a challenge to single combat. King Arthur chooses Gaudifert to face off against Galliot. Gaudifert rode a berry brown or a bay horse, and the other a blanchard or a white horse. Gaudifert triumphs, and Galliot is taken to Arthur's stronghold. The following day, Gologras sends out Sir Regal of Rhone, and King Arthur counters with Sir Ranulf. After a long and hard battle, the 2 knights kill one another, and are buried. Gologras sends out 4 knights, Lewis, Edmund, Bantellus, and Sangwell, who are matched against Sir Lionel, Ewain, Bedivere, and Jaramalance, respectively. Following this battle, in which honours are even, Gologras sends out 5 knights, Agallus, Eumund, Machen, Meligor, and Hugh. For the Round Table appeared 4 knights, Cador of Cornwall, a Wales, Gawain, and Miro. Arthur's side lose a Wales and Earl as prisoners, but capture a Gallas and Hugh, so the honours at the end of it all remained even. At this point Gologras' eye flare in anger, and he declares, "I shall bargain abide, and ain and bring." 2 small bells are rung in the castle's belfry. Arthur inquires its meaning, and again Spinagros explains that the bells were an announcement that the castle lord Gologras himself was now entering the combat in person. It was Arthur's nephew Sir Gawain who insists upon taking up this challenge on the king's behalf. Spinagros is fearful of Gawain's safety and survival, and offers him specific tips in combat, such as to sustain consecutive blows with the shield no matter what happens, and to strike back when the adversary finally lets up, being out of breath. Meanwhile, Sir Kay, who is not assigned an opponent, challenges a man on a brown steed and prevails. At last Gologras appears. He wore armor adorned with red, gold and rubies and many emblems, and silken fringes. He was mounted on a white-complexioned horse studded with golden beryl. Gologras was tall, standing half a foot higher than any other. This single combat between Gologras and Sir Gawain is long and very evenly fought, but at last Sir Gawain gains the upper hand, when Gologras loses his footing on a slope, and Sir Gawain is able to draw his dagger and hold it to his adversary's throat. But Gologras will not ask for mercy. He prefers death to the dishonor of surrendering to Sir Gawain. The victorious knight tries to persuade the other to capitulate, and Gologras replies that if Sir Gawain will pretend to have been defeated and to walk off the field as his prisoner, then he will see that matters are resolved to Sir Gawain's liking once he is in his castle. Despite not knowing Gologras at all, Sir Gawain agrees to this plan, sensing that his adversary is honorable. They pick themselves up from the ground, pretend to fight for a while, then Gologras leads Sir Gawain off the field as his prisoner. Roles have been reversed. King Arthur groans in anguish and begins to weep. There is great joy inside the castle, and the board is set. Gawain too is offered a seat next to the dais. Gologras bangs the table with a heavy wand to command attention, and addresses his noblemen who rule the baronies and towns. He asks for their honest opinion on the following: would they prefer that he were defeated on the field and captured, or be killed so that another lord may replace him to rule over them? The nobles are distressed, because they begin to understand what truly happened. They reply that they would rather have Gologras as the lord to the end of his days. Gologras and Sir Gawain issue from the castle together, unarmed, and Gologras approaches King Arthur in submission, agreeing to have all his land held in fiefdom from the king. A whole week's feasting ensues in celebration, and at the end of 9 days, as King Arthur prepares to leave, he relinquishes his sovereignty of the land and gives full control back to Gologras. Literary analysis. Dialect. Gologras is written in Middle Scots, a dialect closely related to the northern variants of Middle English. It was written in the Anglo-Scottish border country, a region that produced many other poems such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and the Haunches of Arthur. The vocabulary is very similar to that in those poems, and like them, heavy use is made of alliteration. Poetic style. The knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain is written in stanzas of 13 lines each, rhyming abababab cddc. Like another Middle English poem, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, most of the lines of each stanza are alliterative long lines, unlike this earlier and more famous Arthurian poem recounting an adventure of Sir Gawain. It has a tale of 4 short lines at the end of every stanza. In the case of the knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain, However, unlike its more famous cousin, the last 4 lines of every stanza form a separate quatrain, linked by final rhyme to the 9th line, a style of alliteration and rhyme that is identical to that found in the Middle English poet The Aunters of Arthur. Perhaps this challenging rhyme scheme, coupled with the poem's use of a large number of technical terms for combat and costume, a Scots dialect and general unavailability of the text, has contributed to its relative, although undeserved, neglect. The first Perceval continuation parallels. As stated, the knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain is considered a pastiche of materials taken from the first Perceval continuation, though the character name Gologras is unique, and the holy pilgrimage setting do not parallel the French romance. The parallel episodes in the first Perceval continuation has been summarized by Madden in extenso, though with the caveat that Madden used the 1530 printed prose version and not the original verse romance. Sparser summaries in English are given by Bryant and by Roche. The paralleling portions occur in section IV, Castle Orgulus. In Roche's edition of the first continuation, Arthur proposes an adventure, which is to rescue Gawain, who has been held prisoner at the Castle Orgulus. However, before the main adventure, Arthur and his knights experience a side quest quite similar to #the City of Provisions portion of Gologras. Sir Kay sets out to find food for his wearied king, and barges in on a manor near the castle of the Lord of Melialond. He finds a dwarf roasting a peacock, and asks, "Are there any persons about?" Ignored, Kay holds back his compulsion to kill the dwarf on the spot, and now says, in effect, that, since such a lovely bird as this is a mismatch for a hunchbacked dwarf, I shall have it for dinner. The angered dwarf now tells him to leave or suffer the consequences. Kay hurls the dwarf to a pillar supporting the chimney, when the lord of the manor makes entrance. The lord asks what is going on, and Kay is characteristically rude. So the Lord declares, "It is not in the habit of my family to refuse food to anyone who asks," and he grabs the peacock and slugs Kay in the neck, leaving him with an indelible burn mark. Kay reports back to Arthur of his failure, and the courtiers Gawain is sent. The lord of the manor is impressed and gives Arthur and his men a cordial invitation to his manor. King Arthur and his knights with Sir Brandiles as the guide arrive at the proud castle. When Arthur and his men arrive, loud bells are sounded at the castle, and knights from the neighboring lands gather, so that 3,000 banners now flourish the castle. But no all-out siege warfare follows, and each army sends out a representative each day to joust in single combat. Shortly after arriving, a number of single combats take place. First, Sir Lucan defeats one of the castle's knights, then he is himself defeated and taken prisoner. Brandiles is then victorious for King Arthur. Sir Kay loses his joust and, after an interval for a hunt, Sir Gawain is also victorious. The castle's lord, the riche soldier, then decides to fight. Sir Gawain rides against him. The first day, Sir Lucan the butler is given the honor of jousting. He unhorses his opponent, and captured his horse, seemingly to gain victory. However, Brandiles explains that according to rules, victory hinged on him bringing back his opponent as captive, and had he done so, the castle would have surrendered and their adventure be over. Lucan goes back to the field and is met by a different opponent, and this time he is defeated and taken prisoner. The upside is that Lucan becomes inmates with Griflet, and is able to give him the news that Arthur was here to rescue him. The second day, Brandiles wins the joust. The third day, Kay fights a pitched battle, but loses for an infraction of an out-of-bounds rule. Kay tries to insist he won, but is laughed by his peers. The jousting is interrupted by St. Mary's feast, so Arthur and his men go hunting. Sir Gawain discovers a certain knight sitting by a tree. He does not respond to conversation. Sir Gawain tries to lift him up and carry him back to Arthur. The knight tells him angrily to leave him alone, for he wishes to die. Gawain leaves the spot perplexed, but soon gains an inkling of the circumstances when he encounters a maiden who happened to be the knight's betrothed. She was not able to make it in time to marry her knight on the wedding day, and she feared that would be the death of him. Gawain reassures her that her knight is alive. Gawain later learns from Brandelis that this knight turns out to be the ruler of the proud castle, named the Riche-Sous-Deer, and the lady was his Amy. The jousting resumes, and the fourth entrant Gawain also wins. The day after, the Riche-Sous-Deer himself was announced to be the combatant, so Sir Gawain volunteers to fight. In the end, Gawain is victorious and Arthur achieves the adventure. But just as in the English poem Gologras and Gawain, Gawain will pretend to have been defeated by his opponent. So in the meanwhile, Arthur and the others must worry about Gawain's well-being. In the English poem, Gawain agrees to the charade merely to save his opponent's face. But in the first Perceval continuation, the life of the Riche-Sous-Dier's fiancée is at stake because, he says, if the girl he loves knows that he has been defeated, she will die of grief. Further parallels can be found in medieval Arthurian literature, medieval romance in Welsh mythology. In particular, the motif of reciprocity is widespread in early British literature. Alliterative Morte Arthur in the late 14th century Middle English poem known as the Alliterative Morte Arthur, based upon an episode in Geoffrey of Monmouth's mid-12th century Historia Regum Britanniae. King Arthur travels with an army across France in order to meet the Roman army sent against him. He encounters this army in France, defeats and kills its commander, sending the army back to Rome in disarray, along with the bodies of 60 of the chief senators of Rome, and reaches Tuscany before news reaches him of Mordred's treachery, prompting an inauspicious and premature return. The knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain also has King Arthur fighting in France and leading an army towards Tuscany. In the time of Arthur, as true men metal, the king turneth on and tide toward Tuscane, hym to say over the say that Cycles was Saul, the sire that sendeth all seal, southly to Seine. In the time of Arthur, as honest men have told me, the king set off one day for Tuscany, to seek our Lord over the sea, who was betrayed and died for us, our benevolent father, in all truthfulness. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. In addition to the episodes described above, the first continuation of Chrétien de Troyes' Perceval includes a scene in which a magician, who is the father of a knight of the Round Table, Sir Carados, enters King Arthur's court and invites one of the king's knights to cut off his head, promising that the knight can cut off his head afterwards. This is done, and a token blow received in return. The episode is very similar to one composed 200 years later in Middle English alliterative verse. The opening scene of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight found in MS Cotton Nero AX, and is possibly its direct source. In the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, however, the return blow is to be delivered in exactly a year's time. Sir Gawain, on his last night at Sir Bertilac's castle in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, having gone through much to locate the Green Chapel at which he must suffer this return stroke of the axe, is determined, in truly chivalrous style, to be merrier than ever before. Likewise, Gologras, in the knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain, is determined to be seen to be relaxed and merry in his hall, even when things are going badly for him outside and his knights are failing to gain the upper hand. This show of composure in advance adversity becomes a measure of honor and chivalry for both protagonists, and the climax of both the knightly tale of Gologras and Gawain and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight involves reciprocity. In the one, Sir Gawain takes upon himself what he has given to Gologras, that is, the mantle of defeat. In the other, Sir Gawain receives what he has given to his opponent, that is, a stroke of the axe. And not only a stroke of the axe, but earlier also, in Bertilic's castle, a game was played in which everything that Bertilic had gained in the forest was given to Sir Gawain, and everything that Sir Gawain had achieved in the castle was given to his host. More reciprocity. Amos and Emmeline. A 14th-century Middle English poem, Amos and Emmeline, found in the famous Affleck manuscript, tells a story that contains many elements and motifs that are ultimately derived from European folklore. Based upon a 12th-century Old French poem, Amos et Emile, it tells of a pair of unrelated young men who are so alike that nobody can tell them apart. They swear blood brotherhood together, a pledge that is put to the test when Amos has to fight a trial by combat over a crime of which he is guilty. He rides to Emmeline, who by now is married, and they exchange identities. Amos rides back to Emile's castle pretending to be its lord. Emmeline rides away to fight the single combat on Amos's behalf, able to swear that he is innocent of the crime. Mabinogion tales from the Middle Welsh Mabinogion are found in two manuscripts dating to the mid and late 14th century, but many of the tales themselves evolved over a span of centuries. Passed on from storyteller to storyteller, they were by turns expanded and distorted, improved and misunderstood. A mythological tale in the first of the four branches of the Mabinogi, one involving Anvan, not world, or the other world, tells of a hunting expedition undertaken by Pwyll, Lord of Dive. He sets his hounds against those of Arawn, the king of the otherworld, and in an attempt to make amends, agrees to exchange places with this king for a year and a day in order to do battle with another king of the otherworld, Havgan, in a year's time. So Arawn takes on the form of Pywll, Pwyll takes on the appearance of Arawn, and after spending a year in each other's lands, Pwyll does battle with Havgan, who must only be struck once, since if he is struck repeatedly, he will return the next day as fit and well as he ever was.